Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the organizers. It is such an amazing time for us speaking these issues, and obviously our hearts and minds go to our friends in Ukraine, because from this European perspective, this is devastating and totally absurd what is happening. I will be focusing on illiberalism because that's a very, very big topic in terms of how the European Union works as a democracy or as a union of democracies. And if we go back 30 years more ago, at the start of the end of history, democracy was believed to be the only possible way forward. In this general post-1989 euphoria, the European Union had a special place as an anchor of democratic politics, but also as a transformative agent of change. And under the aegis of the EU, the post-1989 European continent was to be composed by older, experienced Western democracies, by the consolidated post-authoritarian democracies in Southern Europe, themselves having transitioned during the 1970s, and the prospective then post-totalitarian democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. The latter eventually rewarded with EU membership in 2004 and 2007. And for many years, the EU projected itself as a transformative power through its enlargement, and with a potential normative impact beyond this border too, in soft power around the world. So for their part, their accession of Central and East European post-communist countries made impressive progress towards democratic pluralist politics in the spirit of the EU's political criteria. Now today, 3 more decades later, the picture is different, and during the last 10 years in particular, there is a growing discussion on illiberalism and backsliding in Europe. To be sure, illiberalism and national protectionism are a global trend nowadays. Yet our questions today focuses on whether the European Union of liberal democracies is really threatened by illiberalism and backsliding. Some countries in particular, like Hungary and Poland, give us this impression that illiberalism is growing inside the European Union, themselves poster children of transition to democracy during the 1990s and the 2000s. And to address this question, I will be asking 3 sub-questions. First, is backsliding an exclusively Central and East European phenomenon of post-communist states, or something more widespread, something continental? Second, what is happening to the EU's transformative power and its ability to sustain the rule of law and fight against illiberal tendencies? And thirdly, what about beyond Europe, and what is the impact of Russia, Turkey, China on European democracies? Now let's start with democratic backsliding. Many scholarly analyses, as well as democracy-rated agencies, are observing the rise of illiberalism in the European continent, mostly in certain Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And in 2016, one of our most prominent Oxford scholars, Nancy Bermeo, was among the first to coin the term democratic backsliding, observing the process of democratic erosion on a global scale. After 2 decades of democratic progress, the guidance of the European Union, the talk in Europe was about deconsolidation of democracy, de-democratization, or de-Europeanization, all of which stood opposite to the previous dominant paradigm of transition to democracy and democratic consolidation, with democracy becoming the only game in town. But with the consecutive crises hitting the European Union, the legitimacy and effectiveness of European democratic governance, in the words of Vivian Schmidt from Boston University, suffered from lower levels of trust from its citizens. But should we be totally surprised? Was this transition a deterministic process towards democratic politics? The reality was and is much more complex. Since the early years of transition in the 1990s, scholars were revisiting the transition paradigm and introducing in our vocabulary democracies with adjectives, such as defective, hybrid, procedural, exclusive, or tutelary democracies, to name a few, to express this illusion of the unilaterality of the transition process and to indicate the constraints along the way. But even in this broader context of transition troubles, there were some countries in the European Union who were negotiating their accession and were considered successful democratizers, including the Baltic states and, more impressively, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. These were countries that were genuinely changing and were ticking all the right boxes of political conditionality in terms of democratic criteria, which the EU and the national elites had set for themselves: separation of power, stability of institutions, rule of law, respect for human rights, and so on and so forth. It goes without saying that democracy promotion from the United States contributed to the success of this goal even more. These countries were rewarded with their accession, and indeed the first part of the 2000s was the pinnacle of successful political transformation of post-communist Europe, including the post-conflict Balkans even, themselves coming out of the Yugoslav wars. So as we know, the global financial crisis of 2008 was the starting point of a series of existential crises for the European Union, started with the Eurozone, followed by the refugee crisis, Brexit, the pandemic, and the crisis with Russia, all affecting the political stability of many countries in the periphery of Europe in the south and the east. It has been 8 years since 2014 and the landmark speech by Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, when he declared his intention to build an illiberal state based on national values within the confines of the European Union, which became the prototype of national populism within the EU. Hungary itself had suffered a tremendous impact from the 2008 crisis, which led the socialists away from power in 2010. And since the start of Orban in power, a former liberal and democratizer himself, sought to undermine any checks and balances in his democracy, weakening media freedom, independence of judiciary, or harming the rule of law. Since then, Orban was repeatedly elected in power, consolidating his illiberalism at home even further. After Hungary, Poland, under the ruling Law and Justice Party and the leadership of Jaroslaw Kaczynski in power since 2015, emulated policies from Hungary towards the judiciary or the media, and strengthening thus the illiberal front within the European Union. More recently, Orban brand has made more strides in the Balkans, where Hungarian leader is reaching out to build close relations with former Yugoslav states in the Balkans. In Serbia, a country not yet a member state of the European Union, another case of a strongman, Aleksandar Vučić, has consolidated his power using similar methods with the Orban template and building those relations with antagonizing powers, Russia and China. And last but not least, Turkish politics during the last years have turned to so impressively illiberal that it is difficult to remember that Tayyip Erdogan started as a liberal politician, introducing democratic changes in Turkey's rigid and exclusionary Kemalist system and negotiating Turkish way into the European Union. Today, the system in Turkey is fully presidential, governed by a powerful leader, having subjected his country into repression of freedoms and moving closer to Putin's form of power, with whom also he holds personal relations. In all of these cases, we witness a wave of autocratization, whose main element is the executive aggrandizement by manipulating the very institutions and procedures that are essential in pluralist politics. In other words, there is no need to have coup d'etats anymore or abrupt breakdown of democracy, but instead, through the achieving electoral majorities, the rulers proceed with the manipulation of electoral laws, voting procedures, constitutional changes that give them more power, control of the media and the judiciary. In all these cases, the strongman rule of the socially conservative parties, they use nationalistic slogans, they distrust media and education, and they react to the hegemony of Brussels. They are all part of a turn towards right-wing politics, which benefit from fragmented center and center-left oppositions. The level playing field is skewed, and there is unequal access to the media resources and state institutions that does not allow for an easy change in power. So majoritarian politics are the rule of the game, and they are the legitimating factor for the sustainability of illiberal rulers. Now, on April 3rd, in a month's time from now, there are national elections in Hungary, the significance of which cannot be underestimated. If Orban loses the elections, one should allow oneself to have hopes for a reversal of the illiberal policies. On the other hand, if Orban wins this election, there will be a further boost to Europe's illiberalism, as this will be a successful case on how to sustain in power a long-running illiberal ruler. Ironically, in April 3, Serbia is also holding elections, which the current leader is expected to win. For these cases of autocratization, the focus is often mostly on the leadership and the hope that if elections manage to bring the end in power of these rulers, things will change. Having said that, due to the long stay in power of some of these leaders, the question is to what degree the system has been corroded and what it takes to reverse the process. Europe's democratic vulnerability is not seen just in the cases of the autocratization that I mentioned, but also in other cases which are not defined by their strongmen, but more as political stagnation, where institutions never function to their intended standards, and state capture, media and freedom, problems with the rule of law became embedded features of their transition process. Many Balkan states are in a stagnation mode in their national politics, which is what they have termed it as transitocracy, a never-ending state of transition that sees their politics going one step forward and one step backward, and where the introduction of institutions and adoption of reforms are not followed by a real implementation as a result of resistance and veto players from within. In post-conflict societies of the Western Balkans, democratic politics are affected by the legacies of conflict, with ethno-national party politics and ethno-nationalist agendas affecting the course of pluralist politics. In many of these stagnating cases, one sees from time to time popular mobilization, civic protests, pro-democracy movements against the excesses and abuses of the executive and corruption. Bulgaria and Romania in particular are two cases where we have seen significant protests lasting for months and leading to the delegitimating and sometimes fall of governing parties from power. But is backsliding and stagnation a matter of a vulnerable post-communist periphery versus the democratically secure Western European core? Or does our understanding reflect a selection bias in perceiving illiberalism as a Central and East European phenomenon, when in fact we see the challenge of democratic politics, maybe in the older democracies of Europe as well? It is true that most Western nations are affected by far-right politics, which are against European integration, against migration, they're socially conservative, and seeking to exploit crisis environment. But this is not something new. Far-right parties existed as part of the political spectrum since the 1960s, when the new right emerged back then, with moments of relative electoral success from time to time from the fringes. They are assisted by crisis, and they have the potential to affect wider democratic politics through disruption, either as challengers of mainstream politics or as influencers of political discourses of mostly center-right-wing parties. The debate on populism became a massive theme during the 2010s when Europe came to recognize the phenomenon as the biggest threat to mainstream center-right and center-left democratic politics. One version was the populism experienced in Greece, which was the product of a very deep crisis and of frustrated citizens who were willing to succumb into the lure of the radical left anti-austerity populism of the government of Syriza. Another form of populism was seen in Italy, a country no stranger to populist politics since the times of Berlusconi in the 1990s, only this time in the form of techno-populism, as the ambivalent relationship between populism and technocracy, and alienating the system from the more traditional left-right division. The most surprising form of Western populism took place in the older parliamentary democracy in Europe, in Britain, in the shadow of Brexit, of fake news, polarization, and permissive and often extra-parliamentary prime ministerial scheming under Boris Johnson. All these Western European populist cases share a convenient Euroscepticism, a cynicism towards domestic institutions, which, however, prove more resilient and protective of the system and avoid fall to autocratization, which is more evident in the Eastern countries, where populism is connected with more ethnic differences, cultural fears, and identity wars, and is more amenable to exclusionary forms of autocratization, illiberalism, and conspiracy theories, and where weaker institutions have a lower capacity to react to the abuses of power. But what is the EU's response to all of this? what is happening with the EU's political criteria and conditionality, its stronger instrument for pressure and its transformative potential. Political conditionality has been at the heart of the EU's approach towards prospective member states, the alpha and the omega for the decision to accept them as member states. Again, the difficulty addressing backsliding should not be totally surprising, as there was already a concern after the 2004 enlargement with the oldest Eastern European countries that the EU did not have the means to monitor further political progress after accession. Once the countries became EU member states, they stopped being scrutinized by the club as they became members of the club themselves. This was somewhat addressed with the premature accession of Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, where the EU established for the first time a post-accession conditionality for these two countries that were not considered to be fully prepared when they entered the EU. It therefore introduced post-accession mechanisms of monitoring their rule of law and made funding conditional upon the appropriate implementation of the rule of law. This was an instrument that came to be used on various occasions with some positive results in some cases, but not fully. However, since the start of the Eurozone crisis, the EU was criticized for downsizing its own political standards for the benefit of other priorities. The survival of the Eurozone and the strict economic conditionality towards Greece and other Southern European economies jeopardized their political systems, especially in the case of Greece. We saw the rise of the criminal far-right Golden Dawn party there, or in Italy, where it caused big political instability with the rise of extreme there too. Meanwhile, the way that the refugee crisis was sorted with a special deal with Turkey to keep the refugees outside EU territory reflected the EU's own democratic deficits in the rise of far-right parties in Western Europe and in the refusal of illiberal regimes, Hungary and Poland, to accept migrants, thus increasing their ethnopopulism even further. Aiming at keeping refugees outside the EU territory, the EU was willing to turn a blind eye towards asylum practices that did not respect conventions and human rights, as well as allowing the autocratic Erdogan in Turkey to strengthen his own power and authority and to blackmail the EU occasionally. Finally, faced with geopolitical challenges from Russia, the EU decreased its democratic monitoring of accession countries in the Western Balkans, promoting what has been termed as stabilitocracy in working with strong men in the region with geopolitical concerns in mind. Faced with illiberal outcomes of the downsizing of its own political conditionality, especially in Hungary and Poland, the European Commission during the last 2 years has re-emphasized at a rhetorical level its affection for the rule of law and developed its monitoring instruments and tied funding with the practice of the rule of law. While the EU has now acquired a toolbox that can put pressure, including the fear of sanctions or the shaming tactics, to countries that do not respect the rule of law, the EU does not have effective means of promoting the actual implementation of rule of law in the countries themselves, lacking coercive mechanisms, which are not part of its responsibility, and having to rely on local elites to implement these changes. It does have at its disposal the suspension of membership, but this is the ultimate option, and the EU does not seem to go that far, even with the often cited case of Hungary, the most important backslider. Again, here the EU has been criticized for its selection bias and for double standards in focusing on Central and East European countries, but not being attentive enough to rule of law issues in all the member states where illicit practices or corruption are also taking place. And finally, what is the impact of Europe of an increasingly growing illiberal world order? Notwithstanding the drawbacks and risks, still the European continent is democratic. Mainstream politics are party politics dominated by mainstream parties of center-right, center-left. Alienation in power occurs without problems. EU templates exist on how institutions should function, and a clear sense on how liberal democracies should operate. Undeniably, democracy is being perceived as the most attractive mode of governance in Europe. More and more, however, the EU is downsizing its global soft power, being unable to have a transformative potential beyond its own borders. Faced with a different world of multipolarity and autocratic rulers, the EU is becoming more transactional in its approach with outside actors. Moreover, it feels that the reverse process of external transformative illiberalism affects the politics of some European states, making the fight against illiberalism even harder. Starting with the US, the years of the Trump administration have been a traumatic experience of political alienation from a traditional partner. Indeed, most of the autocrats in Europe found an anchor and support in the President Trump, who, as we know, hoped for the disintegration of the European project altogether. It is no coincidence that leaders such as Erdogan, Orban, Vucic, and even Janša in Slovenia were all upset by the downfall of Trump from EU leadership. Biden's Democracy Summit was therefore a welcome event that put back the US as a promoter of democracy, a cornerstone of US foreign policy, and a common ideological link with Europe, and put more firmly in the radar screen the conflict between democracy and autocracy on a global scale, the most characteristic example of this fight we are currently witnessing in Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. While this is true, and the division is a significant phenomenon, Biden's summit had another selection bias problem on which countries to invite, which were democracies or not. It was therefore a paradox that when Biden decided to invite Poland, but not Hungary, and raised questions as to which were the criteria of inclusion and exclusion from the democratic club. Russia, for its part, is the epitome of autocracy at home and abroad, and its infiltration of the domestic politics of other countries has taken new heights and reached new levels. Beyond the direct intervention to put puppet governments in its post-Soviet neighborhood, Putin has managed to infiltrate democratic politics further afield through hybrid means, including misinformation, fake news, creation of pro-Russian political parties, staging coups, or interventions in the name of Orthodox religious solidarity, and creating energy dependencies, of course. The secret is not to destroy democracies from a Russian perspective, but to corrode internal politics and create discords and disagreements, a strategy which has met so far with a degree of success in Southeastern Europe, but also in other places in Europe. China, for its part, is coming with its economic influence and long-term strategy in crucial fields such as digital economy, environment, infrastructure, trade. China has its own success in delivering prosperity and stability without the impediments of protest and opposition politics. It has adopted a different conception of what it calls democracy, which links politics with economic results. Interesting that both Putin and Xi use the term democracy to describe their own systems at home, pushing the discussion into the realm of geopolitics and negating EU's pretensions of democratic hegemony in the world and European cosmopolitanism in their effort to promote an alternative world political order. Interesting that most autocrats feel the need to speak in the name of democracy and fake democracy as well. As my final point, one interesting observation, I think, is that in the European context, the normative commitment to democracies may be at risk, given that citizens are becoming more apolitical and more interested in results from governments. And the question becomes whether democracies can deliver better results for their citizens. There is more and more an emphasis on the effectiveness of democratic politics to deliver on economic, environmental, technological, infrastructural, or pandemic results. More often than not, autocratic regimes try to present themselves as better able to lure the hearts and minds of people in Europe through impending funding and investment, which is not complicated by the cumbersome rules and procedures, and avoid the difficult conditions of the European Union. In some ways, then, the understanding for some people goes beyond the liberal versus illiberal debate to the legitimacy and effectiveness of the system. So then the task of democratic politics is to convince their people that they can deliver better than any other system on the current needs of their citizens. Thank you very much, David.